Welcome back to this week's Parent Parsha series, Parashat Terumah. I wanted to continue our discussion that we've been having. I'm definitely getting some positive feedback that this is resonating with people. So I wanted to just take a minute and just briefly mention one small piece that I often talk with parents about. And I know that parents have a tremendous amount of anxiety about, and that is your kid's weight. I notice that, and I hear about it all the time, parents trying to figure out exactly how to manage their kids' weight, whether it's they're worried that their kids are underweight, whether it's they're worried that their kids are a little bit overweight, how to send positive body image messages to their children. And obviously, this is a much larger and bigger discussion than we could possibly have in these few short parenting parsha moments. But I just wanted to point out two important things that I think you want to put somewhere in the back of your head that will go a long way. We've talked about prior to this the notion that we don't want to withhold any item of food from our children, because ultimately, what actually ends up happening is that they actually end up feeling restricted. And then when that food is available, they binge on it. And one of the things that we know is that kids who restrict and then binge ultimately end up actually having a much higher weight than what their natural set point would have been. We all have natural set points. And I think it's important to remember that our own natural set points are going to be very different. Nobody has one body, nobody has one shape. Baruch Hashem, we all come to the table looking different, being different, having different emotional makeups, different genetic makeups, and we look very different as well. And so I think one thing to always keep in the back of our mind is the notion that all children are going to look very different, and they may not necessarily look the image that we thought that they were going to look, and that doesn't make them healthier or less healthy. And I think that that is a critical piece to ground ourselves in, particularly in today's society where there are very clear messages about the ways in which people should look. And in some ways, it all is supposed to look the same, which is not only unrealistic, but it's actually really important to have conversations with our kids, just sprinkling it in here and there, reminding them that all of our bodies are different, all of our bodies are wonderful, and we weren't designed to go through this world looking like the person next to them. And I think that is a critical piece. And so one of the things that we're talking about is we're sending a message to our kids that all bodies are created equally in the sense that they're equally loved, but that they're not created equally in the sense that everybody's bodies look different and are going to be different. And I think that that is something very important to us to tell ourselves, and also to be sending the message to our kids. I think the other piece that I just want to really drive home when it comes to kids and weight, because there's a tremendous amount of anxiety, whether it's driven by your own sense of worry, fears, it could be driven by your own anxieties about your own weight history, and therefore you're worried about your child, whether it's normal weight, underweight, overweight, and that is impacting how you're viewing your child's weight and eating habits and patterns. One thing that we know for sure is that kids who are placed on a diet ultimately end up gaining more weight, and that being on a diet is always a setup for an eating disorder, whether it's anorexia, whether it's bulimia, whether it's binge eating. And one of the things that we know for sure is that when you put your child on a diet, you're sending a message to your child that there's something wrong with them and there's something wrong with their body. And so it's very critical that above all else, we don't create scenarios in which we're ever putting children on diets. Now, there are lots of discussions to be had about how we create, and we started to have those discussions earlier around the cereal, around what we offer our kids in terms of having a home that is providing kids with opportunities to see healthy eating in moderation. But I think the flip side of that is important to be stated, which is we actually really want to be taking a step away from the notion that children should be on diets, and dovetails into a larger conversation, which maybe we can do a quick parenting workshop on for next week, about what we model in terms of how we manage our own weight struggles that have nothing to do with our kids and only to do with ourselves as individuals in the home. But the message for our kids is really critical, which is we know that the research shows that kids who are put on diets ultimately end up only being at a higher weight in the long run than they were without having a diet. And so dieting is actually a setup for increased weight, not actually decreased weight, which is a lot of times what parents' goal is. And the other thing that actually ends up happening is you as a parent are sending a very clear message to your child that the weight that they are at is unacceptable, and that their body is not okay, and that their body is not, if their parent doesn't quote unquote love them the way they are, then who will love them the way they are? And that is such a powerful message that kids internalize, and it carries with them to other moments in time in their lives. Think down the road when they're looking to be in relationships, and really questioning, like, if my parents couldn't even love me at this weight, who will? And I think that ultimately what ends up happening, the goal that parents had in mind of, I just want my kids to avoid X, Y, and Z in the future, actually is not what happens when you put children on a diet. And I think the last thing just to remember before we kind of close this little mini tidbit is that a reminder that kids' weights go up and down. And so oftentimes, and they're supposed to go up and down, they get kids gain a little bit of weight and then they get taller, they go through puberty, they need to gain weight in order to go through puberty. And what parents actually end up doing is they start intervening in those moments, and they're actually messing up the body's natural rhythm. And so one of the things we want to do is have parents hold back their anxiety, take a deep breath, not put their values of body onto their kids, right? We talk about this a lot, right? When we say that parents, when it comes to food, when it comes to bodies, when it comes to weight, we have to really check ourselves, ask ourselves what our baggage is, what we're dealing with, and are we putting that into the room with our kids? And if we are, we need to step it back and be like, that's my stuff. Let me keep it away from my kids. I don't want to give that to my kids. And so two big takeaways. One is that kids' weights are going to go up and down, and that's okay. The second takeaway to remember is that when kids, from a research perspective, are placed on a diet, ultimately, in the long run, their weight is actually much higher than it would have been had they not been on a diet. And the third thing that I would say is that we want to remind ourselves that we're all created so differently, and our bodies are created differently, and it's such a critical message that we want to be sending to our kids, and that those differences are not shameful and they're not bad, and we're really encouraging and creating an environment where kids are able to accept their bodies in all the different ways that they are, whether it's their hair color, whether it's their eye color, whether it's their height, whether it's their shape, whether it's their size, and starting to have those conversations, not as big conversations, but just little sprinkling conversations when we see the opportunity arise. This looks like a lot of information, so I'm actually just going to summarize it. I was actually kind of pondering and stuck a little bit. I was trying to think about a Parsha idea that's somehow related to this parenting child dynamic that people are often experiencing. And so I just wanted to drop one thing that I'm still working out in my brain. So I encourage people to be thinking about it if it's interesting to them and work it out in their brain. In this week's Parsha, we talk about the fact that in the building of all the kelim, all the utensils that are in the Mishkan. So one of the kelim is the Aron, right, which houses the two luchot, the complete ones and the broken ones. And it's in the innermost chamber of the Mishkan, the most holy place. Ultimately, that Aron then gets placed in the Mishkan in Shiloh, and we know that there's a kind of a story around its transfer, and it's from when David is moving it from Hebron to Yerushalayim. But I also just want to remind everybody that there are a couple interesting characteristics about the Aron. On top of the Aron are the two kruvim, these two, and I think this begs the question, what do they look like? There seems to be a lot of mefarshim that try to understand what are the faces of the kruvim. Are they angelic-like? Are they parent-child? Are they female-male? But they seem to be some type of matching pair that are constructed of one piece of gold. They're one of the items in the Mishkan that is miksheh, that is one piece of gold. It's not two different pieces of gold that were constructed and then put together. It's one unit. And they have these wings. And we know that there are times where the wings face each other and there are times when the wings separate from each other. We also know that the notion of the kruvim harkens ourselves back in our memory to the story of Gan Eden. And when the Gan Eden was closed, it talks about the kruvim guarding Gan Eden. So one thing that the Haktava Kabbalah points out, which I thought was interesting, is the Lashon, the use of the word Shnayim versus Sheni. And This is not particularly parity in terms of thinking about equality between relationships. That is a running theme through these three mefarshim, the Hakatava, Kabbalah, the Emek Hadavar, and the Rabbeinu B'chai. But one of the things that's getting pointed out is that the use of the word shnayim versus sheni, and the comparison that's drawn is that when they talk about, let's say, bringing two different korbanot or the two luchot, that they're identical. So here it seems to be that they are not necessarily, the kruvim are not necessarily perfectly identical. And despite the fact that they're made from one piece of gold, there seems to be some type of disparity between them, particularly if we think about them in terms of the fact that maybe one is male and one is female. So those are two very different beings, equal in nature, but bringing different things to the table and different, whether we think about it from a parent and a child. And there's a lot of conversation that's going on about what these kruvim are supposed to represent. And one thing that I really thought, and I obviously think that like there's lots of ways to understand it, and each way of understanding what the kruvim are and how one understands them, whether you understand them to be angels and their role in the idea of malachim and angels in the space of the Mishkan and its in relationship for the Jewish people, whether you think about it as a female and a male, and the notion that oftentimes the Jewish people and Hashem are referred to being in some type of relationship, or whether you understand it to be a parent-child. The one thing that I think comes running through these mefarshim over and over is the fact that there is some type of very intense intrinsic connection between Hashem and the Jewish people. And one thing that I think I really liked at the end of the Emek Hadavar was, and he talks about the fact that if we think about this as a parent-child, where Hashem is the parent and the Jewish people are the child, so there's a recognition that what Hashem in that role gives to the child is not equal. There is a disparity, right? The child is getting more from Hashem than Hashem is getting from the Jewish people. It doesn't necessarily minimize the impact that we can have in our relationship with Hashem and the role that we play, but there's a clear disparity and there's a clear understanding that Hashem is much more mashpia, Hashem has much more influence and gives to us much more powerfully than the other way around. And I think it's important to just be thinking about like what that means in general and why that had to be miksha, one piece together, the idea of it forming out of one piece, that even sometimes in moments in time when they're not equal, at this end of the day, there is a unit that connects them and that qualifies them. And that when we also the idea that like we can always come back to that when something is miksha, when something is connected intrinsically, then it can never be broken. It never started off as two, it always started off as one connected piece. And I think about that in terms of a parent-child, it always starts off as a connected piece. And particularly, let's say with a mother who gives birth to a child, but I think it's true of any parent-child relationship, that we view ourselves as one with the child, and that oneness with our children, the same way that we always feel that despite when we make mistakes as a child, that Hashem always comes back to us. Hashem is always there for us. I think the same is true in this relationship, that we can apply it also with parent and children. And thinking about some of the earlier messages we talked about, we're going to trip up when we're talking with our kids about food and weight. It's hard stuff, and that's why I often get a lot of questions about it, because parents are struggling with it. It's so enmeshed with some of our own issues. It's so enmeshed with so many cultural issues, and it's something that we do on a regular basis. It's something that we do as parents from the first moment that our child is alive, is how to feed our children. There's a lot of anxiety around it. And so I think that one of the things we want to remember, that like the kruvim, this idea of miksha, we're one unit. We started off as one unit with our child, and we're always available to them. And yes, we give more to them, thank God, than they give back to us. But what it also means is that this special connection and special unit allows us the ability to always go back to them and allow ourselves to make mistakes, but fix those mistakes, because we're never giving up on the importance of the messaging that we want to give to our kids for their long-term health and their benefit. And I think it's one very subtle, potentially off the beaten path message that we might be able to take from the kruvim that don't necessarily have to do with the Mishkan, but really as a message to us in terms of the type of parents that we want to be, and really thinking about the ultimate parenting model of Hashem and the Jewish people. Parsha treats. Guys, it's getting sticky. This is like a little bit, even I just had a moment. I was like, oh my gosh, the kalim. And I actually was reminded that like this actually triggered for me the beginning of pandemic, because I remembered actually making small little chalot for each of the tables at the beginning of pandemic for the shulchan that is in the mishkan, and each kid's table got a different matching lechem hapanim. So that's one thing you could do that I didn't put on here. You can make your own lechem hapanim. These cinnamon palmiers, they're so easy to make, mostly because they involve puff pastry, which I kind of hate, but I think in this particular case, they can be used 100%, both for ease and also because they're pretty tasty and pretty. These are considered called angel wing cookies, and I was thinking for the kruvim, for the angel wings, you might be able to make them. There are lots of different dioramas on how you want to potentially attempt to make some of the kelim of the Mishkan. So I gave you 3 different examples of ways in which you could use different types of foods to make a menorah. Again, you want to adjust it to make sure that your menorah lines up with the menorah of the Mishkan and not the Chanukiah. So there's one that's candy that I imagine if it's a snow day tomorrow, we will be making. There's fruit and vegetables I was planning on doing for the Shabbat table, probably just the fruit one, maybe less the vegetable. Some people in our home are not asparagus fans. And then the aron you could also do in lots of different ways. I am potentially thinking about doing like a brownie mizbeach with an animal on top. I like this aron. I've also seen the aron where you have like the sticks, like pretzel rods holding it up, and have 2 small little candies on top for the kruvim, or you could do 2 small bears for the kruvim. So bears might be a little bit of a stretch, but I'm not sure where you're going to find. I guess you could get like little sour bear people. Usually they're in bears, so like that's a little bit of a challenge. I also thought about doing, which I didn't put on here, but like anything floral related, because the menorahs, the actual things that held the candles were in the shape of a flower, and you could like take this in lots of different places. I also think you could do a whole spread around the lechem hapanim, but I just didn't put it on here. But those are some of the different things that I came up with. I can't wait to see what you come up with. I hope everybody stays warm and safe and healthy, and has a great week. And as we move into each day a little closer to Purim, we hope that this is a month filled with simcha, and we should only have good news and good things happening, and each day should bring us a little bit more increased simcha, as we head into the coming weeks and months.